Hi and welcome everyone to Breakpoint. The topic for today is zeroing trust, identity threats, the new attack surface. An identity centric view of threats and security initiatives is slowly taking center stage today in the industry. So much so that Gartner has recently named this space separately as identity threat detection and response. Is it a buzzword or is it here to stay? Let's find that out with our guest for today. We have Sudarshan Pisupati. He's a principal security researcher at Zscaler and the creator of the Aurora project. Hi, I'm Neelu, a technical security enthusiast and your host. I welcome you to the Breakpoint Security Podcast. In this podcast, we'll explore the depths of defensive security. We learn the methods and techniques that the smart security teams are using to solve practical security challenges today and innovate their way into the future. Welcome to Breakpoint, Sudarshan.
Thanks for having me, Neelu. Nice to finally hang out after many years of not meeting, thanks to COVID.
I think recently it's been quite some time that you actually moved from red teaming. We all know you with all the adventure in the red teaming that you've been doing. And when you moved to this space, I was quite excited and curious about, what's happening. There's definitely something promising. That's why we are here today.
Yeah. No, the red teaming space was probably the most fun period of my life, I guess. That's how I started my career, right? When I was in Ernst & Young in the States, I worked red teaming for 5 years and pretty much doing, new assessments every couple of weeks. So it really sort of, that's where I really started my career from. And then obviously once I came back and I joined Smokescreen, that journey continued. So collected a lot of great stories along the way. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and when you talk about red teaming and pen testing, I think this is how industry also, we started in the industry, right? So whoever starts generally starts with pen testing. And then I was thinking of all the past years, right? We have been trying to build a lot of controls in the industry, as many organizations have been doing that even proactively today. Yeah. And that is being done also with the help of not just controls, but ton of products which are there, product and solutions which are there in this space. And I was first of all curious about this aspect, in spite of being a security person. I would want to know, first of all, that there are so many products in this space already. When you talk about identity threat detection, it overlaps with a lot of areas.
Yeah.
And even with respect to each of those areas, you will see that there are, for example, we have always had identity and access management across, right, in terms of controls, in terms of product solutions. In terms of endpoint protection, we have been having EDR, XDR, all of these have been in place now as well. There are other controls like SIEM, SOAR, and you can just name, and there are products around that. So while there are so many products in terms of detection itself and threat intelligence and things like that, where does identity threat detection come in now, particularly, and what is the time when an organization should actually go for it?
Yeah. Funnily, when I was sort of involved in the red teaming, side of things, I still am in the sense that I keep a track of it, though I'm not super hands-on anymore because I moved to product side a lot more. But for us, the holy grail was always that one username password combination that would give us wide access to a wide variety of assets and a wide variety of information. And that's really the quest. I mean, if you have to dumb down red teaming to something very basic, it's getting access to a bunch of credentials that will allow you to get to the target that you want to get to. So, taking examples like from back in the day where, banking systems were under attack. And so the key sort of asset over there was the SWIFT system that would enable global money transactions. And so you had to threat model around all of these, critical banking assets. But essentially what it boiled down to was, did you finally get the username password combination to be able to interact with that system?
Yeah.
And then subsequently, the important thing was you needed to be able to reach that system over the network, right? So these were the two conditions that you had to satisfy. So, for example, you could reach a Swift system, but not necessarily be able to do anything about it because you don't have the username password combination or the credentials required to be able to interact with the system at all. Or you could have the credentials, but you didn't have any network connectivity to the target system. And red teaming is essentially about figuring out how to make these two pieces happen. If you look at how things have been graduating post-COVID, all this on-premises infrastructure that was, wired together with, local networks and WAN networks started going into the cloud. And so now you started having these hybrid environments. So now an organization doesn't just have endpoints that their employees use and a bunch of servers sitting in their data center. They also have workloads and machines that are running in the cloud. They have applications that are running in the cloud. Then it has even expanded out further because in order to boost productivity, there are all of these third-party apps that do a great job. You're talking stuff that allows you to do marketing better, stuff that allows you to do sales better, stuff that allows you to streamline your operations, stuff that allows you to do HR better, right? And in order for the company to become more efficient and grow as a business, it has to now adopt all of these new capabilities that are being made available to us. For example, stuff like ChatGPT even. As this has started to expand, the number of username password combinations are also going up, right? And so in order to, sort of safeguard all of these ways that people are working right now, one of the views that becomes a lot more important really is, how do I secure what we call the identity? And an identity can have many different, core definitions. They could be username, password combinations. They could be keys. They could be certificates. So you don't sort of box yourself into just thinking about a username, password combination, even though for simplicity, we'll talk about it like that. But really now that I have a user who's got access to some stuff that's in the data center, some stuff that's in the private cloud, something that's in the public cloud, which is a third-party application. How do I track all of this, right? And how do I enforce uniform policies across all of these different identities and different use cases in which they're being used is really why this is now becoming a topic. But historically, username and password has always been that holy grail, that thing that most adversaries go after. And so that's one of the reasons why you're seeing it being spoken about right now, though people in the red teaming space and the attack space or the threat research space will figure out that ultimately this is what the game has always been about.
Yeah, so true. I think so. Nothing is on-prem anymore. Yeah, that's reality. And along with the applications, right, when they start getting fragmented with multiple services, I think the attack surface has become fragmented as well for all of us. And it's a good perspective to see it in action and look at the diversity of identities that we have, which is spread across all of these different places. Let's go one step ahead. Let's tie all of this together, like, for example, in the real world. Can you help us sort of visualize on a few cases of real attacks or threats that you were able to materialize, which would have been otherwise prevented or, avoided by having identity threat detection in place? Something that during your red team days you might have tried, which involved identity threats, otherwise which you exploited earlier.
Sure. There's a lot of interesting cases, but I'm going to pick something that I think is incredibly common, and it's something that perhaps the listeners, if they are in the role, can even go and talk to their security teams and validate whether that issue exists within their environments, because there's chances that it is there even today. I'll talk about the example in the context of how identities were being managed historically, and they were being done through Active Directory. Now there's a shift where there's a combination of Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. Yeah, and there are these solutions like Okta, Ping Identity that are also in the picture when it comes to identity. But ultimately, for a lot of organizations, even though Active Directory is now considered sort of legacy technology, it is still what drives a lot of identity and access management within the organization, right? For example, when an employee joins an organization, their account gets created in Active Directory. That account has a way of reflecting on their endpoint, and that's what they use to log into their machine. So it's a critical piece of software that's still running. Now, the thing about Active Directory is, as the name suggests, it's a directory. And a directory is only useful if everybody can see what's in the directory, right? So by design, a lot of information within these directories become accessible so long as you have the most basic set of credentials available to you, right? So any set of basic credentials, no extra privileges, no special accesses, just a simple basic set of credentials that you can create in Active Directory is more than likely enough for you to query and understand the entire directory structure. Now, the directory structure itself contains some really great information. It contains information about users. It contains information about computers, or you want to call them assets or servers in the environment. And more importantly, it also is the authentication system, right? And so it also has somewhere in that system the username and password combination stored for all users in a of course a hashed format, and there's a certain degree of difficulty being able to get to it. But the Active Directory system basically became this holy grail of targets for adversaries. And the thing with identity, when we talk about identity threat detection and response, one of the lenses that we sort of focus in on is different types of identity systems. But then we zone in and say, okay, what's happening within Active Directory? How can I figure out that there are no problems within Active Directory that could lead it to be exploited? This is akin to your vulnerability scan, where you're just proactively scanning to make sure that your configurations are not creating exposures. The second one is, can I do something when an attack is ongoing? That means, can I actively, in near real time or real time, detect active attempts to exploit my Active Directory? And the third is, if somebody goes in and changes something within Active Directory, can I that creates an exposure, can I know about it in real time? So there's a few ways to sort of break down the problem of Active Directory from the lens of identity threat detection and response. Now, what's been happening lately is, and this was reflected in the recent CrowdStrike report as well, which basically talks about this attack called curb roasting. Now, I won't go too much into the technicalities of this attack, but it is one of those really cool attacks that can get you potentially access to compromise the entire Active Directory within 5 to 10 minutes of you being able to compromise a machine within that environment, within the organization. The way this works is, essentially, you have these special set of accounts that are configured with certain parameters. And if that parameter exists, there's a way for you to retrieve the password hash of that account. Okay, so it's a simple thing. There's a user account. Does it have the parameter? Yes, it has it. I have the potential to retrieve the password hash. And now whether or not you can actually guess the password is depending upon the strength of the password. Okay, now the thing is with these accounts is, the way they actually get created in day-to-day business, it usually happens as a need pops up and you need to run, say, for example, you need to install a SQL server for testing, and somebody just goes and creates an account, adds that parameter, goes and uses that account to install a SQL server and forgets about it, right? And so we see accounts that are, the password for them has been last set in 2012. That means nobody has any idea what these passwords are. They've been given abnormally high privileges. So in the Active Directory domain, there is a group called the domain admins, which is the most powerful group. This group we call it the God group, which basically means that you can, if you compromise a username password combination of any account that belongs to that group, you can log into every system as an administrator. And that's basically the target for everybody, to compromise somebody in that domain admins group. And many times these accounts that we were talking about with that special parameter gets put in the domain admins group. So essentially what you have is an attacker sends a phishing email, the user interacts with it, they get remote control of the machine. And so there's tools, that you can do to do that. There's phishing where they make you install TeamViewer, stuff like that. But essentially they take remote control of an employee's machine, and through that are able to directly run this attack, get the password hash, and if they're lucky, they crack it. And in a span of 10 to 15 minutes, they own the entire network. They can log in pretty much anywhere as long as they have the network access to it. And if you take a second and just think about what the impact of that arc of a story is essentially I'm telling you that somebody anywhere in the world has the potential, if they get that reverse connection back where they're able to control a machine and this issue exists within your organization, there's a problem, right? And so that's one of those really cool things that happen. And CrowdStrike reported that there has been almost a 500% increase in specifically this particular attack that I'm talking about. But we've known about this attack since 2016, right? But right now, adversaries are pulling all stops and increasing how they're using these specific capabilities, these specific avenues to compromise the network. That's the attacker's side of the story, right? And when you switch over to the defender side of the story, it's about how do I prevent this from happening? And if it is happening, how do I stop it from happening? And how do I take a response? And that's one of those, little domains where ITDR really starts zoning in and trying to find solutions and productize the way that whole life cycle is managed from a defender's perspective.
Yeah, I think a lot of this, which I think when it started, it was manual. I think now it is all becoming more commoditized, as I might say, like it's all automated, and this is possible, what you just said. So I think when it happens also in the network, I'm sure there'll be changes that can be detected, which earlier a lot of us would be doing manually in spite of having different tools for different areas. So that does make sense that way.
I think data analytics and the quantum leaps that we've seen in data analytics over the last few years has been a key driver for that change. Because ultimately, when you sit in front of us, an analytics system like an incident manager, like a SIM, and you're aggregating, information from all of these different sources, right? For the average SOC analyst to be able to sift through that data is just impossible, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so what we're seeing is improved analytics on top of this data that we're collecting. And how do you bubble up the information to the end user, to the SOC analyst or decision maker at the right point when they need it, in the manner that they need it, and reduce the friction for them to be able to take actions. I'll give you an example. Let's say that I know that Neelu is working from Bangalore, but I've noticed that somebody is attempting to log in to her Azure console from some other location. And so they have this thing called impossible travel, right? Now, what data analytics and these improvements in how we are able to architect products and make it talk to multiple systems is that instead of an analyst going and saying, oh, looks like Neelu should not have been able to do that. Let's press a button and block Neelu from doing this. They can take tiered decisions based on Neelu's profile. Does Neelu have access to sensitive information? Does she access critical infrastructure that is core to the business? Then I might just block. But is the person, mostly using third-party applications that don't host too much sensitive data? Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this and enforce two-factor authentication for a given period of time. And these are the type of tiered decision-making that can be automated that really can help streamline operations. Otherwise, you're just sitting and what I call hoarding data, but not really doing anything with it.
Yeah, and I think even if you have a team, there are many such anomalies. I'm sure you've given one example to us, but there are many such anomalies that you can parallelly detect if you can automate the process. And then, like you said, tied to the impact of the person and the access that they have, or the entity and the access that it has, it can actually take some level of good decision making. Of course, that can be coupled with human intervention. I'm not sure to what depth it can be, but that will definitely give good level of insight and can be very quick in terms of the response from the organization.
Right. No, that's a great point, because see, fundamentally, when practitioners talk about security and threats, we tend to talk about it in terms of attacks and defense and rules, but the business looks at it from the perspective of risk, right? And so one of the things that we're doing with identities in general is we are trying to quantify what is the risk associated with a particular identity and its associated set of activities, right? So when we talk about risk, we are talking about quantification, a hard number, and that number is dynamic. It can change on a day-to-day basis. And you can define thresholds that says, hey, if it's below this risk level, I don't really want to look at it. But if it breaches this threshold level, I want to do something about it, or I want an automated action to be taken. And that really makes it a lot more palatable. And this is not just something that's happening with the ITDR space specifically, though the core way in which you would talk about risk with identities is you would be mapping out all the identities that you see on the wire, you see on the endpoints, you see on these applications, and then try to unify them and then say, what's the risk here? What are the big risks that we can take sweeping changes on and put defenses in place, and what do I have to keep track at a granular level with an identity? So risk language becomes very important when you're communicating anything to do nowadays with any sort of analytics products in general, but ITDR specifically so.
Yeah. So I think we've been talking a lot about the attack side of things. I will switch gears a little bit and move on to the control side. Yeah. So with respect to now that we are in a place as an organization that we are like you were saying that we do have sources of data that we can map to identity threats, and we are planning to have something like an identity threat detection, either solution or set of controls in place. What I was curious to know is, when you start thinking about the implementation in an organization, where you might already have these other products, for example, you'll have a number of solutions, a number of controls around identity access management and other identity related products. You'll have threat intelligence products already in place, right? All of these products already there. And now you're bringing in something to automate your identity threat detection and applying those controls. So there are two sides to it. One is in terms of, I'm sure there'll be changes in terms of the access management itself overall. So it does impact the users. So how do the users adapt, and how do you tackle the technical challenges, particularly where now you have to integrate? Are you integrating now with all of these other products, or do we as a security team look at it differently and independently of all other products which are existing and just focus on the data sources that we have around in the organization?
Right. No, I think that's a very there isn't a straightforward answer to that question. So let's break that down into two parts, right? When you're talking about products in general, and we can even remove ITDR out of this and call it any product, any security product, right? The security product is there to solve a core use case, first of all, right? And if that use case is already being addressed somewhere else, there is no product. You basically reinvented the wheel and you're not really adding any value, right? So in the ITDR space specifically, the real value proposition over there is, let's go after identities, because that's ultimately what's leading to the dominoes falling further down the line, right? Because there was a time where our assets was, uh, we had control over the number of assets that we had, right? We have 40,000 employees, so we have 40,000 laptops, right? And we have 50 servers. But now people are spinning up infrastructure that goes up and down. They have Kubernetes clusters. They have a whole range of applications. And so you've really lost the ability to keep track.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yes.
Right. And you can, it's not to say it's impossible, but the second thing is also to look at this from an organization perspective. The organizations themselves are evolving as they're adopting this, and there is no way to do this right the first time.
Perfectly. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's a journey, it's a transformational journey, right? And so you have to take these stops along the way, evaluate, have you done this right? Do we need to revisit something and then redo it again? And so that part of transformation is something that's happening organically across all the products that were there. Some are no longer serving the use case, some are serving new use cases. Now, when we're talking about the end user challenges, that's where it becomes a little tricky, right? And because that really comes down to design philosophy. And the more the security product interferes with end user experience, the less likely the product or the capability or the tool, whatever it is that you're using, is likely to be useful, right? If every single time I opened Excel, there was a pop-up that was showing up on the right-hand side and I had to click the X icon, then I am going to send an email sooner or later to IT and say, please disable this because this is annoying. It's showing up in my Zoom meeting, right? So largely end user actions have to be either transparent to the user almost entirely. That means they should not know that you exist.
Abstracted for them.
Yeah, right. And the decision making itself is transparent. So for you, Neelu, would be that the transparency would be the fact that the next time you try to log in, it just asks you to change your password. You don't need to know why. The person that needs to know why knows why, right? But for you, it's just a password change. And a password change is a normal, quarterly activity that you do anyway. But now if I'm bombarding you with a password change every week, that doesn't work either, right? And so the challenge from the product side is people that are adopting technology usually build evaluation criteria, and that one of the evaluation criteria there for the end user has always been user experience. So let's take the end user out of the equation, because if it starts interfering with them, it's not going to work. For the SOC analysts and the other stakeholders, in that equation, the complexity is what decisions are being made within your team end to end that you control completely, and what depends upon the priorities and alignment with other teams. For example, if you are doing a web pen test, right? The security analyst takes the report and then has to go and talk to the developer to actually make those fixes, right? And the developer already has a sprint. They have a timeline and it has to align within that timeline, right? And so the challenges with the controls don't tend to be very often the controls themselves, but it is really about a combination of whether it is actually feasible within the environment that you're operating in. So the timelines within which that control is feasible, right? And lastly, whether or not the control itself can be tested and can be shown as effective to justify the level of effort that you put in. Let's put it that way, right? So when you are talking about whether you implement controls, whether it's an ITDR control or any other control, these are the factors that usually come into play. But the controls themselves, like let's take the example of the Active Directory attack that I told you, right? And there is this parameter, right? The fix is to remove the parameter, right? It's dead simple. But you now have the security team that needs to talk to the person that's managing the Active Directory team. The Active Directory team needs to figure out, okay, where is this username and password being, this identity being used? They reach out to the server owner. The server owner says, no, this is running a critical application. You cannot just go ahead and delete that, delete that
Parameter, yeah.
identity,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so the controls themselves, for the most part, tend to be straightforward. It's the other mechanics that come into play with actually implementing controls that at that layer becomes a much more nuanced topic. Not impossible, but definitely not the same for all organizations.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things are driven by the process also. Some of those will be in the business context, like you mentioned, right? So if it's actually creating some business impact and changing that, might be just like switching it off, but it doesn't work like that in reality.
Yeah.
So while you're talking about these changes, there was this thing that I was thinking about in terms of customizing that solution or those set of controls with respect to an organization. So now if you as an organization or as a security team now want to drive something like identity threat detection in your environments, what is the level of customization that you will need to put in, both and from a technical perspective, and what are the considerations there? Are these different for domain specific businesses or specific kind of IT environments where identity access management has been happening in a certain way, or it's easier for certain environments and more complex in terms of implementation for others?
Yeah. See, identity is right now at least a universal concept. Pretty much, I would say most of the organizations above a certain, above a certain size, obviously, will have identity controls, identity and access management policies in place. Whether they enforce that through, your Okta or Ping identity or whatever, or whether they do it through Azure or do it through Active Directory is really where people differ quite widely, right? So identity itself is already widespread. The problem with identities is also widespread. Okay, if you look back at some of the more recent attacks, the some conversations keep coming up every decade, right? So simple things like calling the user and requesting an OTP, requesting them to divulge their OTP still works.
Yeah.
Still works, right? And so the problem itself still exists, right? What we are seeing is new and more diverse and ingenious ways of getting to that information. We are seeing a variation in how much business impact it's having across the organization, but ultimately that's what is there, right? Like it is a problem. If you think about, a topic that perhaps most of your listeners will be aware about, which is ransomware. Okay. If you think about the ability for ransomware to spread, is its ability to compromise identities and use that identities to log into multiple systems and then steal information off of those systems. Without that, it cannot infect hundreds and thousands of machines, but it is doing that, right? So really the ways in which you can now address this problem is, we spoke about, you briefly mentioned EDR, XDR, right? And so there is stuff that you do on the laptop itself, right? And now there is stuff that you need to do within your identity systems. And there is stuff that you need to do on your network, right?
Yeah.
So the way you can sort of simply break this down now is, if somebody is sending me a malicious email and I double click on it, that code should not execute. And that's the job of the stuff that's running on the endpoint. Let's say that it does end up running for whatever reason. Either there is nothing on the endpoint or there was a bypass or whatever that was. I need to have a second layer of control to make sure that the identity itself. Remember that if you still get a username password combination, you can do whatever that user does, regardless, right? So if you have access to 3 applications, I might not have access to 100 applications, but I can still access those 3 that you have access to, right? So the second is, how do I control access to make sure that a user has only access to the applications that they require and not automatically giving them access to 100 applications over the network. And that's one place where controls are being added. That's where your term zero trust comes in, where users are verified to make sure that they can only access the applications that they need access to. And the third one is where your identity comes in, because the thing that actually stitches all of this together is the identity itself. When you talk about identity, you say, does this user have access to this application? You're talking about user, and typically when you talk about user, you're talking about identity. So I think it's time, it's the right time to start exploring what the space can give you, regardless of the size of your organization. And let me tell you one thing is that I think most people, when they have this conversation internally, will figure out that they're probably already doing it, right? Well, for example, Active Directory assessments have been around for a long time. Like, they have been there for years. And essentially what you were doing there was some form of, we just used to call it Active Directory assessment, Active Directory posture assessment. But now you have a lot more in terms of, it's not just Active Directory, it's this also, and there's that also. And so to broadly define it is why we are calling it identity. But people are already doing it, and they have been doing it. But you're just supercharging what you're doing already and trying to make your life a lot simpler in the process.
Talking of supercharging, I was going through all the other capabilities that identity detection systems might have. And I came across, I think, a lot of correlations apart from just detecting anomalies also happens behind the scenes. How about the false positives? What in your experience is the false positive? Is it matured already, or it's still maturing, and there is room for improvement in that?
Yeah. False positives has always been like the bane of the industry in general. And the place where false positives really become a problem is because you lack the context of why a particular event fired in the first place, right? For example, if you logged in from Bangalore today and then you logged in from Mumbai tomorrow, let's say hypothetically I flagged that as, oh, that should not have happened because Neelu always logs in from Bangalore. It could just be that you were in Mumbai for a meeting, and the red eye, and I don't have that context. There are false positives that are written that get generated because the rules themselves are very broad, right? Which is why so for example, for that one single rule, you might end up getting 1,000 events and subsequently alerting the person 1,000 times. And so people sit and try to tune that down to a reasonable number. Where I think I think the effectiveness it's a learning journey is what I would say. False positives do happen, even with ID threats. But I think the introduction of that risk scoring that we spoke about a little earlier, making sure that you have your right thresholds that more accurately reflects what's happening within your organization, is really what's going to help you take decisions on things that matter and not have to worry about things until they don't pass that threshold. Because at the end of the day, resources, is the one thing that is a limiting factor in cybersecurity. Most people are running with just the right number of people, or sometimes they don't even have all the people that they need. And so this becomes a topic where if I set my thresholds correctly, I'm not going to bother about the rest, because it's not even realistic to bother about the rest. I don't even have the capability to look at the rest, but I'm literally just doing it for this top, these top 10-20% of things that I really care about, because that's where I've defined my threshold and that's where I'm going to take action. And that should be zero false positive. That threshold should only be breached if it's not a false positive. And that's something that you will have to figure out with the person that you're working with, to figure out from the either it's a vendor side or the tool side or your internal teams to figure out. But yes, it will be there, but there are ways to handle it.
Yeah, so basically, if from a team's perspective, when we are configuring these products or solutions for that matter, of course, we'll have to keep the business context in mind if there are larger changes happening, plus also the non-negotiables, like you're putting it. So those things where you can clearly define, you have a clearly defined set of parameters and things that you want to be alerted for, which for sure and are in your priority list, would definitely is a good way to start. And then of course you can customize it later as you grow along with the solution, as I like to put it.
Yeah, I think if your organization is already using, and I'm guessing this would already be the case, but if your organization is already sort of shifted purely away from on-premise to some cloud provider, and is figuring out how do I get my users from here to talk to applications there. This is already a topic of conversation. If this will already be a topic of conversation, this is primed for talking about this within the organization. But everybody's on their own journey,
Yeah.
right. And yet another product, yet another capability, yet another 3-4 letter acronym is not necessarily what everybody wants to hear about. But I think the real way to look at that is if you're not seeing evolution, if you're not seeing these new things pop up, you're talking about an industry that's stagnating, or an industry which has solved the problem. And clearly we haven't solved it.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, it's a solved problem. Nobody cares about it anymore. So your new 3-letter acronym is not going to do anything. But clearly we haven't solved the problem. We've got ways to go. And I think the evolution is important to keep up with. I'm sure that a lot of people get jaded. I get jaded with it. But I think it speaks to the fact that the industry is not sitting and just watching and waiting for things to happen.
Yeah, I think a lot of this will gradually be a question for teams when we scale, the organization scales, and you're not able to keep up. Like security teams will not be in hundreds everywhere. So either you create the automation that you need, or you basically procure it. So I think that's how it works on this side. But a little bit on the side, I think while we have been talking about identity threats and then controls around it and implementation and things. I was thinking of identity. I think it also applies to some other identity products, but from the perspective of identity threat detection, there are a lot of correlation that we are doing, like we were saying, and then we are working with a lot of different data sources. And of course, a numerous identities of different kinds that we were talking about. How about the privacy aspects of that? Like, with respect to that, do we need to do something extra as a security team? Do we, just because we're dealing with, thousands or maybe millions of such identities, and of course, different data sources, different kind of correlation. Now everything is brought into one place, which means also that there is a possibility of that becoming a critical asset itself. And you, of course, need to safeguard that. So from that perspective, and given that a lot of different regions, right, listeners could be from any region, we have data protection compliances coming in, regulations coming in for all the regions gradually. So how do we take care of that with respect to having such controls and solution in place in our own organization?
Yeah. The good part, I think, from at least from a data privacy perspective, is that the ones that we run into the most often are pretty well defined in terms of what you have to do. There will be controls on, for example, how you store and process the data. where you store and process the data, who can access it, right? And there are audit practices built around purely data privacy. And so as long as you're working within that framework, you are, there are things that are okay to do and there are things that are not okay to do. But for the most part, privacy wise, there are very clear guidelines on what you can and cannot do. And there are, in larger organizations, there are also privacy officers, right? And there are their own internal audit teams that allow you to sort of demystify any place where it's not clear whether you can do something or not do something.
No, from that perspective, actually, so for example, from a data privacy perspective, do these solutions allow or have provisions for example, separate data storage for different kind of users from different products or from different regions? Like, do they come with these kind of provisions which can be customized?
Yeah, for the most part, for example, at least because I don't go super deep into this topic in general, like because I don't go into the architecture side as much on a
Okay.
day-to-day basis. But at least at a broad strokes level, what I do know is that there are region-specific compliances that need to be maintained, and those are relatively easy to maintain because they are, your cloud has regions, right? And so you can make sure that the data is, geographically stored in a place where that compliance allows for it. But it's really it's not necessarily a concern if you're talking about the type of data itself that we're storing. um, I mean, when you talk about any sort of an aggregation system, like for example, your endpoints are looking at every single process that's starting on your system, right? Your SIM is aggregating data about, from a vast array of other systems, maybe not just other security systems, but even, application logs, stuff like that. And they're all getting pooled into one place. And for the most part now, all of these solutions are cloud driven because you simply cannot scale storage on premises as you would want to anymore. And so with that, I'm not saying that these things are perfect yet, but I think at least the guidelines that we typically run into are fairly self-explanatory. What's allowed, what's not allowed. For example, simple stuff like, if you're storing passwords, it has to be stored in a particular format. It has to use this algorithm, and so it is fairly detailed, right? And remember that many organizations that are especially in this business tend to go over and above the minimum the basic requirements. That's important, right? So they do go to an extreme, and you would see that through the presence of a privacy officer in the org chart, because that's what they would do.
Yeah. I think there are anyways a lot of controls in that space, and I think it boils down to becoming a more like architecture specific area, like you called out, and then the placement of the product and the way it stands, and the way data flows across different components, across different obviously other components as well in your organization, will be something that your security team as well as data privacy officers and others can have a look at and define the path ahead.
Funnily enough, when you talk about identity, especially let's say in the Active Directory space, right? Like that internally within the organization, like pretty much everybody knows everybody else. I mean, they have the capability to, I say quote unquote, know, simply because it's a directory service. You can ask about anybody and it will tell you about that other person. The way architecturally, there's a few options where you can do it, where you process the information on one machine itself, and then only send back what's essential that complies with that regulation.
Okay.
So that's also one of those capabilities that people have. But yeah, in general, because cloud is now de facto in how we are able to bring quantum improvements in efficiency of security operations in just day-to-day management. I mean, if you even look back 6 years ago, Neelu, you would have remembered that there would be people that were like, "Oh, the Exchange server is down," and like, and then all hell is broken loose, and like,
Yeah.
but that stuff doesn't happen as much as anymore because you're not managing it, right? And the number of job descriptions that say, expert in maintaining PIX firewall is it's just not there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
True.
Mm.
Okay, I think the last question that I had was, what does it like? What is the future of? I know it's been just a few years that we started with the concept. There were a lot of distributed ideas around this and a lot of products and solutions that we've been using. Now we're focusing on identity threats and automating that, and with the help of solutions that are there in the market, and controls which are there. But with respect to, since we were talking about correlation with all of the data sources and different processing engines, is there still room for improvement? What does the future for such solutions look like to you?
See, we can track evolution if you just zoom out even to a decade ago, you can track evolution very simply, right? Your AV became your EDR, and your EDR then became something else.
Yes.
We started talking about threats to threat intelligence, right? And so the evolution will continue because we are always going to be confronted with new use cases based on how the surrounding ecosystem evolves. That is always going to be the case. And with identity, unless we find a way in which we fundamentally redefine authentication altogether and authorization altogether, it seems that the scale of the problem will continue to keep growing. Right? The scale will continue to grow. As the scale grows, new use cases present themselves, and on that trajectory itself, you're going to see continued innovation until a point where it becomes a technology that is just something that you have. I mean, it's like you don't have IDDR, like, right? Just like how people today are, you don't have EDR, like, what are you doing, right? And so I think Gartner's like hype cycle, they put out this thing called the hype cycle, right? And so I think the hype cycle is a very nice way to contextualize how technology is evolving. And that's not to say all technology evolves. Some do die on the vine, but broadly, it's a nice way to contextualize where the future is. And I think the future for me really is in the fact that we haven't even started scratching the surface of just how complex the problem really is. Because it's one thing to talk about a view where we just say, hey, let's hook into these identity systems and see what we can do there, versus the fact of the matter is identity is distributed in so many places. It is distributed in the most basic one, the passwords.xls file that people maintain on their laptop is a source where an identity and identity related information is stored. And so you're looking at a fairly comprehensive problem space. I think everybody's going to come at it with picking up chunks and then stitching things together. But I'm excited about where it's going to go, because I don't think we have scratched the true extent of the problem. Because one is we will come up with a solution, and then the solution gets tested on whether it is practical. The stakeholders that adopt that solution will give you feedback, and that's how products evolve, right? So we are in that really good sweet spot where the definition of what we are doing is expanding. The number of systems are expanding. There's innovations in how authentication is taking place. There's innovations in how users and even individual machines have identities now. So how do you manage the life cycle around those? It's a huge space. It's a huge space. And so there's a lot to do there. I don't see it diminishing at any point of time unless we really screw it up.
Yeah, I think with the increasing technology itself, right? Technology is changing so fast. The way we identify is also changing, and as long as we have users and we have systems which are using the technology, the attack surface will keep growing, and automatically, of course, we will need to manage identities better along the way. So yeah, thanks a lot for all those answers, Sudarshan, and I think it's been quite insightful. It's left me with more questions, but in the interest of time, I will stop it here. Thanks a lot for joining us in this episode and answering all the questions.
No, it was great to be here. I mean, I'm glad we made this happen. So yeah, thanks for having me. This was a fun conversation.
Cool. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll see you all in the next episode. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey folks, that's all we had for today. I hope you enjoyed this one. Visit the podcast page for more such interesting episodes. You will find the speaker suggestions and other details in the show notes below. If you're interested in a security challenge of your own or would like to hear from a specific speaker or team, let me know in the comments below. Lastly, if you liked the episode, please go ahead, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and share with others in the community. It always means a lot when you do that. We'll see you in the next episode. Until then, Breakpoint signing off.